Take a seat and keep your mouth shut, Judge Robert Harris snaps without lifting his eyes from the paperwork. I don't have time for attitude from people like you. The words slice through courtroom 4B like a blade. David Anderson, perfectly dressed in a charcoal grey suit, remains standing. Harris's head jerks up, his pale face immediately flushing red. The gavel crashes down so hard it echoes off the oak-paneled walls. Did you hear me, boy? I said sit down. The word boy hangs in the air like poison. Typical. Probably can't even comprehend the charges against you. David slowly takes his seat, spine straight, eyes locked forward. His leather briefcase rests beside him, gold initials DA gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. Reckless endangerment, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest. Harris's voice drips with condescension as he deliberately slams papers onto his desk. 60 days in county jail. Maybe that'll teach you some respect for authority. The bailiff steps forward aggressively, hand moving toward his cuffs. The sentence hits the courtroom like a sledgehammer to glass. But then David Anderson does something that freezes everyone in place. He stands up slowly, reaches into his jacket, and withdraws something that will destroy Judge Harris's entire world in the next 60 seconds. Next will leave you speechless and prove that sometimes justice arrives wearing a prosecutor's badge. If you believe that no judge should ever sentence defendants based on their race, type justice below. Have you ever witnessed someone's entire career collapse in real time? Judge Robert Harris built his reputation on one unshakable principle. The law meant order, and order meant knowing your place. For 16 years, his courtroom had been a monument to that twisted philosophy. The mahogany-paneled walls bore witness to his unwavering commitment to what he called practical justice. Justice isn't about feelings, Harris would tell new clerks, settling into his high-backed leather chair like a king claiming his throne. It's about maintaining the natural balance of society. Some people understand respect naturally. Others need to be taught through consequences. The statistics told a devastating story, though no one dared speak them aloud. When Jerome Williams appeared before him for assault charges, 18 months in county jail. When Bradley Thompson faced identical charges just 2 weeks later, 6 months probation and community service. The difference? Jerome was black, Bradley was white, but Harris would call it considering character and community background. Look at the defendant's history, Harris would intone during sentencing, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Look at where they come from. Look at their associations. The pause before associations always lingered heavy with unspoken meaning. His colleagues at the monthly judicial conference would nod approvingly over expensive whiskey at the country club. Harris is tough but fair, they'd say. Doesn't let political correctness interfere with real justice. That's why his district stays so orderly. The truth was far uglier. When Keisha Roberts, a brilliant young black attorney, attempted to object during a domestic violence hearing, Harris silenced her with surgical precision. "Counselor, perhaps you should focus on learning proper courtroom procedure before attempting to lecture this court." His tone suggested she was a child playing dress-up in her grandmother's clothes. 15 minutes later, when her white colleague David Martinez raised the exact same objection, Harris's response was entirely different. Sustained. "Thank you for bringing that important point to my attention, Counselor." The pattern repeated itself case after case, hearing after hearing. Black defendants received sentences 30 to 40% harsher than white counterparts for identical crimes. Black attorneys found their motions dismissed without genuine consideration. Black families in the gallery received warnings about courtroom disruptions for reactions that white families displayed without consequence. But Harris was brilliant in his cruelty. He never used slurs, never made overtly racist statements on the record. Instead, he weaponized respectability politics and coded language with the precision of a master surgeon. "This defendant clearly lacks the moral foundation necessary for rehabilitation," he would declare when sentencing young black men. For young white men with identical records, this appears to be an unfortunate lapse in judgment. "I'm confident this young man can learn from his mistakes and contribute positively to society." The local media loved him. Judge Harris, tough on crime, strong on values, read the headline in the State Tribune when his name surfaced for appellate court consideration. The article painted him as a no-nonsense jurist who didn't let political correctness interfere with justice. What the article didn't mention were the hushed conversations in courthouse bathrooms, the worried whispers among public defenders, the way black court reporters quietly requested transfers to other divisions. He's got it out for us. Tony Williams, a veteran public defender, confided to his colleague after Harris sentenced his 18-year-old client to 2 years for marijuana possession. Same amount of weed. White kid from the suburbs gets diverted to rehab. My client gets prison. But like everyone else, Williams kept his voice down. Harris wielded power like a medieval lord, and crossing him had consequences that extended far beyond any single case. The state attorney's office on 7th Street hummed with controlled chaos at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. Young prosecutors clutched coffee cups like lifelines, while paralegal staff wheeled document boxes through marble corridors. Phones rang with the relentless urgency of justice delayed. David Anderson walked through the main entrance with the measured pace of someone who owned the building, which in many ways he did. As lead prosecutor for civil rights violations, his authority extended into every courthouse in the state. "Excuse me," called Jennifer Davis, the new victim services coordinator, intercepting him at the security desk. "Sir, if you're here to file a complaint, you'll need to take the elevator to the 3rd floor." David paused, studying her with calm eyes that had seen too much injustice to be surprised by assumptions. "Thank you, Miss Davis. I'll find my way." The security guard, Michael Torres, looked up from his newspaper and immediately straightened. "Morning, sir. Didn't expect to see you this early." Jennifer's face flushed crimson as realization dawned. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize—" "No apology necessary," David replied smoothly. "It happens more often than you'd think." He continued toward the elevator bank, his Italian leather briefcase swinging slightly with each step. Behind him, he heard Torres explaining in hushed tones, "That's David Anderson, lead prosecutor. Been here longer than most of the judges." On the 5th floor, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Assistants looked up from their keyboards. The energy in the room recognized its source, like a tide acknowledging its moon. "Morning, boss," called Sarah Martinez, his senior deputy, barely glancing up from a stack of case files. "The Harris materials are on your desk." Statistical analysis came in at midnight. "It's comprehensive." David nodded, continuing to his corner office. Through the glass walls, he could see his team had been working through the night. Charts and graphs covered every available surface. Bankers' boxes lined the walls like soldiers in formation. Inside his office, the scope of the investigation revealed itself fully. 16 years of sentencing data, organized meticulously by race, crime type, and outcome. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was surgical in its precision. His phone buzzed. "Anderson." "David, it's Dr. Rachel Coleman at Statistical Services. You need to see these numbers immediately. I ran the analysis 4 times because I couldn't believe the disparity." "How severe?" 43% harsher sentences for black defendants compared to white defendants with identical charges and criminal histories. In some categories, it exceeds 60%. I've analyzed judicial bias for 12 years, and I've never encountered anything this systematic. David made careful notes. "Send everything to my secure email. And Rachel, this stays completely confidential until I give you clearance." "Of course, but David, this is going to destroy careers when it comes out." "That's exactly the point." After hanging up, David opened his laptop and accessed the state attorney database. His clearance level provided access to sealed records, judicial performance reviews, and disciplinary complaints dating back decades. 3 hours later, the picture was crystal clear. Judge Robert Harris wasn't just biased. He was methodically, brilliantly, systematically biased, every decision calculated to maintain what he saw as the proper social order. His assistant knocked softly. "Sir, Tony Williams is here about the Morrison case. Send him in." Tony Williams entered, closing the door behind him with the caution of someone who understood the weight of what they were discussing. "David, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, the Harris situation. Maybe we should involve the Federal Civil Rights Division before—" "No." David's voice was quiet but absolute. "This stays state level. We handle our own house first. But if we're talking about systematic civil rights violations, Tony, how many cases have you tried in Harris's courtroom over the years? Maybe 3 dozen. Why?" David turned his computer screen toward him, displaying a comprehensive spreadsheet. "Because according to this data, your black clients receive sentences averaging 39% harsher than your white clients for comparable crimes." Tony's face went pale. "Jesus Christ. It's not your fault. He's been playing this game for 16 years, and he's exceptionally skilled at it. But that ends now. What's your plan?" David stood and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse across the street. From this angle, he could see Harris's chambers on the 4th floor, where countless lives had been destroyed by prejudice disguised as justice. The plan is evidence, overwhelming, undeniable, bulletproof evidence that will end his career permanently. But there's one piece missing. What's that? Personal experience. Every defense attorney in the city has stories about Harris's bias, but they're all hearsay. What we need is a prosecutor experiencing it firsthand. Tony frowned, then his expression shifted to alarm. "Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." David smiled for the first time that morning. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to become the prey. The conference room in David's home had become a war room. 3 bankers' boxes contained 16 years of meticulously organized case files. Sentencing disparities arranged by crime type, defendant race, and attorney representation. The statistical evidence was overwhelming, but statistics never captured the human devastation. David pulled out a red folder marked Personal Impact. Inside were letters from families whose lives Harris had shattered. Photos of young men who entered his courtroom with hope and emerged with felony convictions that would follow them forever. "Judge Harris looked at my son like he was garbage," wrote Maria Jefferson, whose son Malik had received 2 years in prison for something a white defendant got probation for. "Same crime, same amount of drugs, but my Malik didn't have the right skin color for mercy." David's secure phone buzzed with a text from his wife Patricia. "Working late again. Dinner's getting cold." He typed back, "Almost finished. Save me a plate." But he wasn't almost finished. He was just beginning the most dangerous phase of his career. The plan had crystallized over weeks of careful analysis. His brother Anthony's recent traffic stop in Harris's district provided the perfect template. The officer's report painted a familiar picture: aggressive black male, failure to comply with lawful orders, suspicious behavior during routine traffic stop. Anthony Anderson was everything Harris typically targeted: successful, confident, articulate, MBA from Emory University, senior vice president at Atlanta Financial Group, married, father of 3, active in his church. Never so much as a parking ticket on his record. The perfect defendant to prove that none of those accomplishments mattered when you stood before Judge Robert Harris. David opened his laptop and pulled up the case management system. Anthony's hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Routine traffic violations, but the resisting arrest charge elevated it to Harris's jurisdiction. "Baby brother always was too trusting," David muttered, scrolling through similar cases. The pattern was always identical: black professionals thinking their credentials would protect them. Black families believing the system would recognize their dignity. They all learned otherwise in Harris's courtroom. His private cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Judge Patricia Thompson, Circuit Court, his former Harvard Law classmate. "Patricia, didn't expect to hear from you this late." "David, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Are you building a case against Robert Harris?" Silence stretched between them like a tightrope. "Why would you ask that?" "Because his name came up in a very quiet conversation at the judicial conference last week. Someone mentioned unusual activity and prosecutor records requests, specifically sentencing data from his district." David chose his words carefully. "If someone were hypothetically investigating systematic judicial bias, what would your advice be?" Patricia's sigh carried the weight of 20 years on the bench. "My advice would be to proceed with extreme caution. Harris has powerful allies throughout the system. But David, if someone were hypothetically building such a case, they'd have my complete support. What he's been doing, It's destroying faith in our entire justice system. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. After hanging up, David opened his secure email and composed a message to Sarah Martinez. Clear your schedule for Friday morning. Emergency federal civil rights consultation. Tell absolutely no one. And Sarah, if something happens to me Thursday, you're acting lead prosecutor until further notice. He encrypted the message and sent it. On his desk, Anthony's case file lay open next to David's official prosecutor credentials. Two paths diverged before him, and he was about to take the one that would either restore justice or end his career entirely. David picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized weeks ago. Torres, it's David Anderson. I need a favor, a significant one. The security footage from the courthouse parking garage would later show David Anderson arriving at 6:47 a.m., 43 minutes before Harris typically began his day. He carried only his briefcase and a small recording device that would capture everything Harris said during what the judge assumed was a private power display. By 7:15 a.m., David had reviewed every detail of Anthony's case file 3 times. The charges were textbook harassment, the kind Harris had built his career on. What made this different was that David Anderson wasn't just Anthony's brother. He was the state's most experienced civil rights prosecutor, and he was about to provide the final piece of evidence that would end Harris's reign of judicial terror. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Get arrested in Harris's district for charges serious enough to warrant immediate arraignment, but minor enough to avoid federal involvement initially. The resisting arrest and aggressive behavior charges from Anthony's case provided the perfect template. David opened a secure folder labeled Operation Justice and reviewed the profiles of every prosecutor in his office, their caseloads, their availability, their likelihood to be assigned emergency cases. Everything was in place. By Thursday afternoon, Judge Robert Harris would either be exposed as the systematic racist he was, or David Anderson's career in law enforcement would be over forever. 3 weeks earlier, Anthony Anderson had been driving his new BMW through Harris's district after a client meeting when his world changed forever. The traffic stop had been textbook harassment, though Anthony didn't realize it at the time. "License and registration," Officer Bradley Stevens had demanded, his hand resting conspicuously on his weapon. "Do you know why I stopped you?" "No, officer, I was driving the speed limit." "Don't tell me how to do my job. You were weaving between lanes, driving erratically. Have you been drinking tonight?" Anthony's dashboard camera would later prove he'd maintained perfect lane discipline throughout the 15-minute drive. But the camera evidence wouldn't matter in Harris's courtroom. "Sir, I haven't had a drink. I'm coming from a business meeting. Step out of the vehicle now." What followed was a carefully choreographed escalation that Stevens had perfected through years of practice. Every command delivered with increasing aggression, every response interpreted as suspicious behavior or failure to comply. "Keep your hands visible. Don't reach for anything. Turn around. Spread your legs." The body camera footage, which David had obtained through official channels, showed Anthony complying with every instruction while maintaining remarkable composure. But Stevens' report painted a different picture entirely. Subject appeared agitated and argumentative, made several suspicious movements toward interior of vehicle, failed to immediately comply with lawful orders, demonstrated aggressive behavior, consistent with someone attempting to conceal evidence or weapons. The charges were exactly what David had expected: reckless endangerment, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest. The holy trinity of charges that allowed Harris to exercise maximum judicial discretion while maintaining plausible legal cover. David had studied hundreds of similar cases. The pattern never varied. Black professionals pulled over for phantom violations. Reports filed describing aggressive behavior that body cameras never captured. Charges filed that elevated minor infractions to Harris's jurisdiction. Now sitting in his office at 11 p.m., David realized Anthony's case provided more than just evidence of systematic harassment. It provided the perfect blueprint for infiltrating Harris's courtroom as a defendant, rather than a prosecutor. He opened his laptop and pulled up the officer assignment schedules for Harris's district. Stevens worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift on Thursdays. His patrol route included the stretch of Highway 285, where Anthony had been stopped. David's plan was crystallizing with mathematical precision. Drive through Stevens' patrol area at approximately 2 a.m. Thursday morning. Ensure his behavior could be interpreted as suspicious without actually breaking any laws. Allow Stevens to initiate a traffic stop that would follow the exact same script used against Anthony. The beauty of the plan lay in its authenticity. Harris would see exactly what he expected to see: another uppity black man who needed to be taught his place. The judge's systematic bias would be captured on official court records, witnessed by a room full of observers, and documented by court reporters who had no idea they were recording history. David opened a secure communication app and sent an encrypted message to Dr. Rachel Coleman. Statistical analysis needs to be ready for immediate deployment by Thursday afternoon. Federal agents should be on standby. Her response came back within minutes. Data package complete. Standing by for your signal. Next, he contacted Linda Garcia, the courthouse security coordinator who had been quietly documenting Harris's discriminatory behavior for months. Linda, I need all security cameras in courtroom 4B operational Thursday morning, full audio and video recording. They're always operational for Harris cases, came her reply. Too many complaints from families about his behavior. Security footage is our insurance policy. The irony wasn't lost on David. Harris's own paranoia about being challenged would provide the evidence to destroy him. David picked up Anthony's case file one final time. His younger brother's experience would soon be repeated, but with one crucial difference. When Harris sentenced David Anderson to county jail, he would be sentencing the state's lead civil rights prosecutor, a fact that would remain hidden until the perfect moment. The law degree from Harvard hung on his office wall like a certificate of war. Next to it, his Prosecutor of the Year awards gleamed in polished frames. Below both, 3 commendations for civil rights advocacy caught the amber glow of his desk lamp. Tomorrow night, all of those achievements would either be validated by the most important prosecution of his career or destroyed by a desperate gamble that could end everything he'd worked to build. David closed Anthony's file and locked it in his desk drawer. By Friday morning, the Anderson brothers would both be part of legal history. Anthony as the victim whose case exposed systematic judicial racism, and David as the prosecutor who risked everything to prove it existed. Justice, David reflected, required perfect timing and absolute courage. He was about to discover whether he possessed both. Thursday morning arrived grey and cold, matching David's mood as he prepared for the most dangerous gambit of his legal career. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Orchestrate his own arrest to experience Harris's systematic bias firsthand. At 1:47 a.m., David Anderson drove his personal vehicle, a modest Honda Civic chosen specifically to avoid seeming too successful, through Officer Stevens' patrol area. He maintained perfect legal compliance while ensuring his driving pattern could be interpreted as suspicious by an officer looking for reasons to make a stop. The traffic stop unfolded exactly as predicted. Stevens approached with the same aggressive demeanor he'd used with Anthony, but David was prepared for every escalation tactic. License and registration. Have you been drinking tonight? No, officer. I'm returning from visiting family. Step out of the vehicle, keep your hands visible. David complied with every instruction while Stevens's body camera recorded the encounter. The charges that followed were identical to Anthony's case: reckless endangerment, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest. By 6 a.m., David was processed through the county jail system. His arrest record listed his occupation as unemployed, a deliberate omission that would prevent Harris from researching his background before the arraignment. Sarah Martinez received the encrypted message at exactly 7:15 a.m. Package delivered. Proceed with contingency plan. Federal team on standby. The courthouse buzzed with unusual energy Thursday morning. Word had spread among the court staff that someone significant had been arrested overnight, though details remained mysteriously vague. Linda Garcia positioned herself in the security office, where she could monitor all camera feeds from courtroom 4B. She'd been documenting Harris's discriminatory behavior for 18 months, waiting for someone with enough authority to act on her evidence. Dr. Rachel Coleman arrived at the federal building carrying 3 boxes of statistical analysis and audio evidence. Her meeting with FBI agent Sarah Miller was scheduled for 10 a.m., exactly when Harris's court session would begin. "Agent Miller," Coleman began, spreading charts across the conference table, "what you're about to see represents systematic civil rights violations spanning 16 years. The graphs told a story of mathematical precision in their racism. Black defendants receiving sentences 43% harsher than white defendants for identical crimes. Plea bargain offers systematically worse for black families. Appeal success rates that varied dramatically based on defendant race." "Dr. Coleman," Agent Miller said, studying the data, "this suggests deliberate, systematic discrimination at the judicial level. It's not just systematic, it's calculated. Judge Harris has spent 16 years perfecting techniques that allow him to discriminate while maintaining legal cover." Meanwhile, in courtroom 4B, Judge Robert Harris reviewed his morning docket with the satisfaction of someone who controlled every aspect of his domain. The defendant Anderson case looked routine, another example of the kind of criminal behavior he was paid to address firmly. Harris had no idea that every word he spoke would be recorded by multiple cameras, analyzed by federal investigators, and used as evidence in the civil rights case that would end his career within hours. At 9:45 a.m., David Anderson was escorted into the courthouse wearing standard county jail attire. His expensive suit had been replaced with orange jumpsuit and shackles, a visual transformation designed to reinforce Harris's preconceptions about black defendants. The bailiff, Michael Torres, recognized David immediately but said nothing. He'd been briefed by Linda Garcia about the investigation and understood his role in documenting everything that happened next. Tony Williams, the public defender assigned to represent unemployed defendant Anderson, nearly choked when he saw David in shackles. Williams had worked with David on dozens of civil rights cases, but he maintained his composure perfectly. "Your Honor," Williams addressed Harris, "I'm here to represent Mr. Anderson on the charges filed overnight." Harris barely glanced up from his paperwork. These routine cases required minimal attention, just long enough to impose sentences that would maintain order and teach proper respect for authority. What Harris didn't know was that representatives from the FBI, the State Attorney General's office, and the Federal Civil Rights Division were positioned throughout the courthouse, monitoring every aspect of the proceedings through Linda Garcia's security network. The stage was set perfectly. Judge Robert Harris was about to demonstrate the same systematic bias he'd employed for 16 years, except this time his victim would be the state's most accomplished civil rights prosecutor. David Anderson sat in the defendant's chair, his hands folded calmly, waiting for Harris to provide the final piece of evidence that would expose 16 years of judicial racism and send shockwaves throughout the entire justice system. The gavel was about to fall on more than just David Anderson's case. It was about to fall on Harris's career, his reputation, and his freedom. Comment your country and city below. Let's see where judicial accountability is being demanded worldwide. Your participation shows that equal justice under law is a universal principle. The federal building 3 blocks from the courthouse had become a nerve center of coordinated justice. Agent Sarah Miller reviewed video feeds from courtroom 4B, while Assistant Attorney General Karen Thompson prepared federal charges that would be filed within hours. "The statistical evidence is overwhelming, Dr." Rachel Coleman explained to the assembled federal team. "But what makes this case unprecedented is the real-time documentation we're about to obtain." Thompson studied the charts showing 16 years of sentencing disparities. "Dr. Coleman, you're certain these numbers will hold up under federal scrutiny?" "I've triple-checked every calculation. Judge Harris has systematically sentenced black defendants to terms averaging 43% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. The pattern is so consistent, it can only be intentional." Agent Miller received an encrypted message on her secure phone. "It's starting. Anderson is being brought into the courtroom now." All eyes turned to the monitor showing courtroom 4B in high definition. David Anderson entered in shackles, his dignified posture unchanged despite the orange jumpsuit and restraints. Judge Harris barely looked up, already shuffling through papers with the bored efficiency of someone processing routine business. "Your Honor," Public Defender Tony Williams announced, "I represent Mr." Anderson on charges filed overnight. Thompson leaned toward the monitor. Harris has no idea what's about to happen. Back in the courthouse, Linda Garcia coordinated security camera angles to ensure every gesture and expression would be captured. She'd waited 18 months for this moment, the chance to document Harris's systematic bias in real time, with federal witnesses monitoring every word. The courtroom gallery contained an unusual mix of observers. Local reporters drawn by rumors of something significant, law students attending what they assumed would be routine proceedings, federal agents positioned strategically throughout the room. Judge Harris finally looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting through predictable stages. Initial boredom gave way to mild interest as he studied David's appearance. Then came the familiar hardening of his features, the subtle transformation that signaled his decision-making process engaging in its systematic bias. "Mr. Anderson," Harris began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated defendants for 16 years. "You stand accused of reckless endangerment, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest." David remained perfectly still, his hands folded, his expression calm. He'd prosecuted hundreds of cases and understood courtroom dynamics better than Harris realized. "I see you're unemployed," Harris continued, consulting the arrest report. "No permanent address listed, typical pattern we see far too often in cases like these." In the federal building, Thompson made notes on every coded phrase Harris employed. Cases like these would become evidence of discriminatory language in the federal indictment. Harris reviewed the officer's report with theatrical slowness. Officer Stevens notes aggressive behavior, failure to comply with lawful orders, suspicious movements. These are serious charges that reflect a pattern of disrespect for authority. Dr. Coleman pointed to her laptop screen, showing comparative data. "Watch this." He's about to impose a sentence that's 40 to 50% harsher than what white defendants receive for identical charges. "The court finds the defendant guilty on all charges," Harris announced with satisfaction. 60 days in county jail. Maybe that will provide the discipline you clearly lacked growing up. The sentence hit the courtroom exactly as David had predicted. Gasps from observers who recognized the disparity. Frantic note-taking from reporters sensing something unprecedented unfolding. Agent Miller spoke into her secure radio. "Sentence imposed. Pattern confirmed. Initiate final phase." But David Anderson wasn't finished. He rose slowly from the defendant's table, his movement drawing Harris's attention like a magnet. The judge's expression showed irritation at this breach of protocol. "Sit down," Harris ordered. "You've been sentenced." "This matter is closed." Instead, David reached into his jumpsuit and withdrew something that would change everything. The courtroom fell silent as federal agents throughout the gallery prepared to document the most important moment in the case. Judge Robert Harris was about to learn that justice sometimes arrives wearing a prosecutor's badge, and that 16 years of systematic discrimination had finally met its match in David Anderson's carefully orchestrated investigation. The next 60 seconds would expose decades of judicial corruption and prove that no judge, regardless of power or influence, was above the law when faced with a prosecutor willing to risk everything for justice. The courthouse clock struck 11:30 as Harris's gavel finished echoing through the marble chamber. David Anderson stood perfectly motionless, absorbing the weight of 60 days in county jail for what amounted to a traffic violation elevated by systematic bias. "Court is adjourned," Harris announced, already reaching for his next file. The power rush of crushing another challenging defendant still coursed through his veins like a drug. "Bailiff, remove the defendant." But David didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and spoke with a quiet authority that cut through the courtroom chatter like a blade. "Your Honor, I request permission to address the court." Harris's head snapped up, his face flushing crimson at this unprecedented breach of protocol. In 16 years on the bench, no defendant had ever dared challenge his authority after sentencing. "The defendant has been sentenced. This matter is completely closed. Bailiff, remove this man immediately." David's voice grew louder, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms throughout the state. "Your Honor, I am David Anderson, lead prosecutor for civil rights violations, State of Georgia Special Crimes Division." The words hit the courtroom like a physical explosion. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Court clerks froze at their desks. The bailiff's hand hovered over his handcuffs, uncertain whether to proceed with removing a senior prosecutor. Harris's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and growing panic as the magnitude of what he'd just done crashed over him. What did you say?" Harris stammered, gripping the edge of his bench so tightly his knuckles went white. David reached into his jumpsuit and withdrew his official prosecutor credentials. The gold badge caught the overhead lights as he held it high enough for everyone in the gallery to see clearly. David Anderson, lead prosecutor, badge number 47291. I have served in this capacity for 15 years, specializing in civil rights violations and judicial misconduct. The color drained from Harris's face so quickly he appeared to age a decade in seconds. His hands began trembling as he realized he'd just sentenced the state's most senior civil rights prosecutor to jail for driving while black in his district. This is some kind of elaborate joke," Harris stammered desperately. "You can't be. I mean, you're the defendant. You were arrested for driving while black in your district, Your Honor. Something I orchestrated specifically to experience your systematic bias firsthand and create an unimpeachable record of your discriminatory practices." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones while attorneys whispered urgently to each other. The bailiff stood frozen between David and Harris, watching 16 years of judicial authority crumble in real time. David opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder bearing official state seals. "For the record, Your Honor, I have been conducting an official investigation into systematic judicial misconduct in this district for the past 8 months. This morning's proceedings represent the final piece of evidence in a comprehensive federal case, documenting 16 years of racially biased sentencing." Harris tried to regain composure, straightening in his chair with the desperation of someone clinging to sinking authority. You entrapped me. This is prosecutorial misconduct of the highest order." "I exposed you," David replied calmly. "Every word you spoke, every assumption you made about my character based solely on my appearance, every discriminatory decision you rendered, it's all part of the official record now, witnessed by federal agents and documented by your own court reporters." Harris's clerk stared at David with dawning recognition. She'd seen him before, not as a defendant, but entering the courthouse through the secure prosecutor's entrance, carrying himself with the authority she now understood completely. "Furthermore, Your Honor," David continued, consulting a document bearing federal letterhead, "I need to inform you that as of this moment, you are under formal investigation by the State Judicial Board, the Federal Civil Rights Division, and the Attorney General's Office for systematic violation of defendants' constitutional rights under Title 18, Section 242. Harris made one final desperate attempt to salvage his authority. "This court does not recognize these highly irregular proceedings. I demand immediate dismissal of—" "Your Honor," David interrupted, his prosecutor's instincts taking complete control. "You no longer possess the authority to demand anything. As of 11:45 a.m., you are suspended from all judicial duties pending the outcome of our investigation." The gavel fell from Harris's nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor, a fitting symbol of justice finally falling into the right hands. David Anderson stood in the defendant's chair, but his entire demeanor had transformed. Gone was any pretense of submission. In its place stood the commanding presence of Georgia's most accomplished prosecutor, about to deliver the evidence that would rewrite civil rights law enforcement forever. The transformation in courtroom 4B was electric and complete. David Anderson remained at the defendant's table, but his posture had shifted entirely. Gone was the submissive stance required of the accused. In its place stood the commanding presence of the state's most accomplished civil rights prosecutor. "For the record," David announced, his voice filling every corner of the chamber with prosecutorial authority, "the state of Georgia hereby files formal charges of judicial misconduct, systematic civil rights violations, and abuse of power under color of law against Judge Robert Harris." Harris gripped his gavel like a drowning man clutching driftwood. "You cannot do this. I'm a sitting judge appointed by the governor. There are procedures, protocols, proper channels. There are indeed proper channels, David replied, opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency. This is an emergency suspension order signed by Chief Justice Maria Rodriguez at 8:15 this morning. You no longer possess judicial authority in this courtroom or any other throughout the state. The words struck Harris like physical blows. His face cycled through shock, rage, and desperation as the reality of his situation crystallized with devastating clarity. David withdrew a second document, bearing multiple official seals. Furthermore, this courtroom is now under the direct jurisdiction of the State Prosecutor's Office, pending federal investigation. Bailiff Torres, please ensure all recording equipment remains fully operational. Today's proceedings are being documented for comprehensive federal review and will serve as primary evidence in our civil rights case. David turned toward the packed gallery, where reporters scribbled frantically and cameras rolled without interruption. Every major news outlet in the state had received anonymous tips about significant developments in Harris's courtroom, though none understood they were witnessing legal history unfold in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press and public," David announced with the commanding presence that had made him the state's most feared prosecutor, "what you have witnessed this morning represents the culmination of 8 months of intensive investigation into systematic racial bias in this judicial district. The traffic stop that led to my arrest, the charges that were filed, the proceedings you observed today. Every element was carefully orchestrated to capture Judge Harris's discriminatory practices in an uncontrollable, undeniable format." He gestured toward Harris, who sat frozen behind the bench like a deer caught in headlights, his 16 years of unchallenged authority crumbling with each word David spoke. Over the past decade and a half, Judge Robert Harris has systematically sentenced black defendants to terms averaging 43% harsher than white defendants for identical crimes committed under identical circumstances. This morning, he demonstrated that same calculated bias by sentencing me, a senior state prosecutor, to 60 days in county jail for violations that typically result in fines, probation, or complete dismissal. Channel 7's senior courthouse reporter stood up, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Mr. Anderson, are you saying you deliberately orchestrated your own arrest to expose judicial bias?" "I'm saying I provided Judge Harris with the opportunity to demonstrate the same systematic discrimination he's exhibited toward hundreds of black defendants over 16 years. The only difference between this morning and his typical proceedings is that today's defendant possessed the resources, authority, and evidence necessary to fight back effectively." David opened his briefcase once more and withdrew a thick binder that represented months of painstaking investigation. This contains comprehensive documented evidence of Judge Harris's pattern of racial bias, 47 detailed case comparisons where black and white defendants received drastically different sentences for identical crimes. Statistical analysis performed by Dr. Rachel Coleman, showing systematic disparities that exceed federal thresholds for civil rights violations, audio and video evidence of discriminatory behavior. And now, thanks to this morning's proceedings, real-time documentation of that bias being applied to a sitting prosecutor. Harris finally found his voice, though it cracked with desperation and barely controlled panic. "This is entrapment of the most egregious kind. Prosecutorial misconduct that violates every ethical standard in our legal system. I'll have your badge and your career for this outrageous deception, Anderson." David smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. "Your Honor, former Your Honor, entrapment requires law enforcement to induce someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit. I simply provided you the opportunity to demonstrate behavior you've exhibited consistently and systematically for 16 years. The record will show that every action you took this morning was entirely consistent with your established pattern of discriminatory sentencing." David advanced toward the bench, his prosecutor's instincts taking complete control of the proceedings. The man who had been sentenced to jail minutes earlier now dominated the courtroom with absolute authority. "Would you like me to present specific examples for the record?" David's voice carried the weight of hundreds of successful prosecutions. "Marcus Williams, age 19, first offense assault charge, 18 months in county jail. Connor Bradley, age 20. Identical charges filed the same week. Identical circumstances represented by the same public defender's office. 6 months probation and community service. With each comparison, Harris seemed to shrink deeper into his high-backed chair, the symbol of his authority becoming a throne of judgment against him. Malik Jefferson, college graduate with no prior record, caught with personal use marijuana, sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Tommy Morrison, identical charge filed 3 days later. Same amount of contraband, same lack of criminal history. Diverted to drug court with no jail time whatsoever. David's voice gained strength as he presented case after case, building the prosecutorial argument that would destroy Harris's career and send shockwaves through every courthouse in the state. The pattern never varies, Judge Harris. Black defendants receive prison sentences, while white defendants receive second chances. Black families receive lectures about moral foundations and personal responsibility, while white families receive compassion about youthful mistakes and temporary lapses in judgment. David reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew a small digital recorder that would provide the most damning evidence of all. But perhaps most devastating to your defense are your own words, recorded during private chamber conferences over the past 18 months. He pressed play, and Harris's voice filled the courtroom with crystal clarity. These people think they can waltz into my courtroom and demand special treatment. My grandfather didn't fight in World War II, so these criminals could lecture me about fairness and constitutional rights. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Harris's most loyal court staff stared at him with undisguised horror and recognition of the systematic racism they had enabled through their silence. The recording continued with Harris's voice discussing specific cases. Schedule the Jefferson sentencing for Thursday afternoon. I want him to sit in jail over the weekend, thinking about his life choices before I send him upstate for 2 years. David turned off the recorder and addressed the stunned courtroom. That recording, along with 46 hours of similar audio evidence, has been submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation as primary evidence of systematic civil rights violations under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Harris's attorney, Robert Harrison, who had been frantically taking notes throughout David's presentation, looked up with the expression of someone realizing his client was far beyond salvation. The legal implications were staggering, and every additional piece of evidence made Harris's situation exponentially worse. Your Honor, Harrison began weakly, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's electric tension, my client respectfully requests immediate recess to consult with counsel regarding these highly irregular and unprecedented proceedings. Your client, David interrupted with prosecutorial authority that filled the chamber, has no remaining authority to request anything whatsoever. He is now a defendant in a federal civil rights investigation that will determine whether he spends the next decade in federal prison. His only remaining right is the constitutional protection to remain silent, a right I strongly advise him to exercise immediately. The gavel lay on the floor where Harris had dropped it, creating a fitting symbol of justice that had finally fallen into the proper hands. But David wasn't finished. The months of careful planning and investigation were about to reach their devastating conclusion. Agent Sarah Miller entered through the main courtroom doors, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and Assistant Attorney General Karen Thompson. Their presence transformed the atmosphere completely, shifting from local courthouse drama to federal law enforcement operation. Agent Miller, David announced with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was reaching perfect execution, please present the federal charges that have been prepared based on this morning's evidence and our comprehensive investigation. Miller stepped forward, consulting an official document that would change Harris's life forever. Robert Harris, by the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Department of Justice, you are hereby charged with conspiracy to deprive persons of their civil rights under color of law in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. The words echoed through the chamber like gunshots, each syllable carrying the weight of federal authority and 16 years of accumulated evidence. Harris's face had gone completely white, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning. Furthermore, Miller continued with bureaucratic precision, you are charged with systematic abuse of judicial authority, willful violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and conspiracy to deny due process rights to defendants based on race, all constituting federal crimes punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. Harris tried to speak, but only a strangled whisper emerged from his throat. The man who had commanded absolute authority over hundreds of defendants now found himself unable to form coherent words as his world collapsed in real time. Assistant Attorney General Thompson stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Mr. Harris, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. The irony was overwhelming and deliberate. The man who had systematically denied fairness to hundreds of defendants was now being afforded every protection he had routinely dismissed when applied to black families in his courtroom. David addressed the courtroom one final time as the lead prosecutor whose investigation had exposed decades of judicial corruption. The evidence against Judge Harris is overwhelming, comprehensive, and completely undeniable. 8 months of investigation, 46 hours of recorded conversations revealing systematic bias, statistical analysis showing discriminatory patterns that violate federal law, and now this morning's real-time demonstration of that bias applied to a sitting state prosecutor. He gestured toward the stack of evidence boxes that federal agents were now methodically cataloging as official evidence in what would become the most significant civil rights prosecution in the state's modern history. Every case Judge Harris handled over 16 years will be reviewed by independent federal counsel. Every defendant who suffered under his discriminatory sentencing will have their conviction reviewed for potential resentencing, appeal, or complete dismissal. This investigation represents more than exposing one corrupt judge. It's about restoring faith in our justice system's fundamental promise of equal treatment under law. Channel 11's senior legal correspondent stood up from the press gallery. Mr. Anderson, what will happen to Judge Harris's pending appellate court nomination that was scheduled for final approval this week? David smiled with grim satisfaction. As of 1 hour ago, that nomination was officially withdrawn by the governor's office. Judge Robert Harris will never sit on any judicial bench again. His law license will be revoked, his pension forfeited, and his legacy will serve as a warning to any other judge who believes they can discriminate with impunity. The federal marshals stepped forward with handcuffs that gleamed under the courtroom's harsh lighting. Mr. Harris, please stand and place your hands behind your back. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The man who had ruled his courtroom like a medieval lord, who had destroyed lives with systematic bias disguised as justice, was now being handcuffed in the very chamber where he had perverted the law for 16 years. As the handcuffs clicked shut with metallic finality, Harris finally found his voice, though it emerged as a desperate whisper. This is a witch hunt orchestrated by activists. I was tough on crime exactly as the community expected. I maintained order and respected traditional values. You maintained racism, David corrected with prosecutorial precision. And now you'll face the same justice system you perverted, except you'll receive the due process you systematically denied to others. The federal agents began escorting Harris toward the side door that would lead to his processing and detention. As they passed David's position, the disgraced judge looked directly at him with eyes filled with bitter recognition and the dawning understanding of how completely he had been outmaneuvered. I should have known, Harris whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 16 years of unchallenged authority crashing down. You were too composed, too controlled. Real defendants break under pressure in my courtroom. David met his gaze steadily, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had dedicated his career to pursuing justice against impossible odds. Real prosecutors don't break at all, Your Honor. We build better cases, gather stronger evidence, and ensure that justice ultimately prevails, regardless of how long it takes. As Harris disappeared through the door that would lead to his federal detention and processing, David turned to address the remaining crowd of reporters, court staff, and observers who had witnessed legal history unfold in real time. Today represents a victory for justice, But not because one prosecutor exposed one corrupt judge, David announced, his voice carrying the weight of months of careful investigation and years of witnessing systematic injustice. Today's victory occurred because our legal system ultimately worked when individuals chose to take extraordinary risks to hold the powerful accountable for their abuse. The gallery erupted in sustained applause, but David raised his hand to request silence. He had more to say, and the message needed to reach far beyond this courtroom. When institutions fail to protect the rights they are designed to uphold, individuals must step forward and accept personal risk for the greater good. When those in power abuse their authority systematically, those without traditional power must find innovative ways to document that abuse and demand accountability. David gathered his materials with the methodical precision that had characterized every aspect of his investigation. At the courtroom door, he paused and looked back at the empty judge's bench, where Harris had wielded discriminatory power for 16 years. 16 years of systematic injustice ends today in this courtroom, David declared, his words carrying the weight of hundreds of cases that would now be reviewed and potentially overturned. Tomorrow we begin the much harder work of rebuilding trust between our communities and the justice system that is supposed to serve everyone equally. The gavel remained on the floor where Harris had dropped it in shock. David left it there deliberately. Some symbols, he reflected with deep satisfaction, were more powerful and meaningful when they remained broken, serving as reminders of justice that had been perverted and finally restored. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Attorney General's office on the 15th floor of the federal building. David Anderson adjusted his new nameplate, Deputy Attorney General, Civil Rights Division, and smiled at the profound irony of his transformation. The man who had been sentenced to 60 days in county jail for driving, while Black was now the state's highest-ranking prosecutor for civil rights violations, with jurisdiction over every courthouse and judicial district in Georgia. The transformation had been swift, decisive, and absolutely warranted. Judge Robert Harris was now serving 18 months in federal prison, the same facility where many of his victims had been unjustly incarcerated due to his systematic bias. His law license had been permanently revoked, his judicial pension stripped entirely, and his reputation destroyed so completely that even his exclusive country club had quietly revoked his membership to avoid association with his crimes. The Harris precedent, as law schools across the nation now called it, had revolutionized prosecutorial tactics and judicial oversight nationwide. 17 states had adopted the Anderson Protocol, systematic investigations of judicial bias using statistical analysis, recorded evidence, and, when necessary, first-hand documentation of discriminatory practices through carefully orchestrated scenarios. David opened his laptop and scrolled through the morning's case updates, each representing a life that had been damaged by Harris's systematic racism and was now being restored through comprehensive legal review. 43 defendants had been successfully resentenced after independent federal review, determined their original sentences were the product of racial bias. Malik Jefferson was completing his college degree, with his conviction completely overturned and expunged from all records. Marcus Williams had received a full gubernatorial pardon and was now studying law himself, inspired directly by David's example of using the legal system to fight systematic injustice. A soft knock on his door interrupted his review of the morning's victories. "Come in." Sarah Martinez entered, carrying a thick folder that represented another victory in their ongoing battle against judicial corruption. "Boss, excellent news from the Georgia Supreme Court. They just issued a unanimous ruling on the Morrison case, complete reversal with specific language citing systematic judicial bias as grounds for overturning the conviction." David nodded with satisfaction, though it was tempered by the reality of how much work remained. How many additional cases are we currently reviewing for potential bias-related reversals? 437 pending comprehensive review, with more cases being identified daily as our statistical analysis expands. The pattern recognition software has found discriminatory sentencing going back to Harris's very first week on the bench. 437 lives damaged by one man's systematic prejudice disguised as judicial authority. The number still staggered David. serving as a constant reminder of why his investigation had been both necessary and urgent. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted text from FBI agent Miller. Harris' appeal denied unanimously by Federal Circuit Court. All convictions upheld. Complete justice served. David smiled and immediately forwarded the message to Dr. Rachel Coleman, whose statistical analysis had provided the mathematical foundation for everything that had followed Harris's exposure and prosecution. Her response came back within seconds. "One corrupt judge down, too many more to go, ready for the next case whenever you give the signal." The next case. Because Robert Harris wasn't unique in the American judicial system, he was simply the first to be exposed and prosecuted, using these innovative investigative methods that David had pioneered through personal risk and professional courage. 3 additional judges in neighboring districts were now under federal investigation using the Anderson Protocol. The systematic nature of judicial bias was being revealed courthouse by courthouse, district by district, as David's methods were applied across the country by prosecutors who had been inspired by his success. David stood and walked to his window, looking down at the courthouse where his entire investigation had begun with a single orchestrated traffic stop and arrest. A new judge, Patricia Williams, a brilliant young black woman with impeccable credentials and an unwavering commitment to equal justice, now presided over Harris's former courtroom. Early reports from attorneys practicing in that courtroom suggested a dramatic, immediate shift toward fairness, equality, and genuine judicial impartiality. The contrast with Harris's systematic bias couldn't have been more stark or encouraging. David's phone chimed with a news alert that brought a smile to his face. Anderson Protocol adopted in federal courts nationwide. The article described how his innovative investigation techniques were being implemented systematically across the federal justice system, creating accountability and oversight where none had existed before. David picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, preparing to record the video message his communications staff had been requesting for weeks. The time had come to share the complete story with a national audience that needed to understand what was possible when individuals risked everything for justice. "Good evening. I'm David Anderson, Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights." He paused, looking directly into the camera with the same calm authority he had displayed in Harris's courtroom 6 months earlier. 6 months ago, I walked into a courthouse as a defendant in orange shackles and exposed 16 years of systematic racism disguised as judicial authority. Today I want to tell you why that risk was necessary and what we've accomplished together. He continued, his voice carrying the weight of hundreds of overturned convictions and restored lives. Judge Robert Harris represented more than one corrupt individual. He represented a system that had failed in its most fundamental responsibility, providing equal justice under law to every person, regardless of race, background, or economic status. David's expression grew more intense as he addressed the camera directly. The investigation that brought down Harris required 8 months of preparation, statistical analysis of thousands of cases, coordinated federal cooperation, and ultimately, my willingness to experience that bias firsthand as a defendant in his courtroom. He paused, allowing the weight of that decision to resonate with viewers who might never have imagined a prosecutor deliberately getting arrested to expose corruption. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice requires extraordinary courage from ordinary people, then share it with everyone you know. Subscribe to our channel for more stories where systematic corruption faces consequences and where individual courage changes entire systems. David's voice gained strength as he delivered his final message. And remember, when institutions fail to protect the rights they're sworn to uphold, individuals must rise to fill that gap. When the powerful abuse their authority, those without traditional power must find innovative ways to demand accountability. He smiled at the camera with the confidence of someone who had proven that justice was possible, even against impossible odds. Justice isn't just blind, it's persistent. And when good people refuse to accept injustice, the system eventually responds. After recording the message, David returned to his desk where a new folder marked Operation Accountability contained preliminary evidence against Judge William Crawford in the Northern District. The pattern was eerily similar to Harris's systematic discrimination, mathematical precision in racist sentencing disguised as judicial discretion. Dr. Coleman's statistical analysis showed Crawford's black defendants receiving sentences 41% harsher than white defendants for identical crimes. The audio recordings from his chamber conferences revealed the same coded language Harris had used. The systematic nature of the bias suggested another deliberate, calculated approach to judicial racism. David opened the secure communication application on his laptop and sent an encrypted message to Agent Miller. Crawford investigation approved for Phase 1 implementation. Statistical analysis confirms pattern. Requesting federal coordination within 30 days. The response came back immediately. Federal team standing by. Anderson protocol ready for deployment, awaiting your operational timeline. David leaned back in his chair, looking once again toward the courthouse where Patricia Williams was restoring faith in judicial fairness. The work was far from over. Systematic change required systematic effort, case by case, judge by judge, until the entire system lived up to its fundamental promises. His secure phone rang with a call from Tony Williams, the public defender who had represented him during the Harris investigation. David, I just wanted to thank you again for what you accomplished. I've been practicing in Patricia Williams' courtroom for 3 months now, and it's like night and day. Fair sentencing, respectful treatment, genuine consideration of each case's individual circumstances. That's what justice looks like when it works properly, David replied. And Tony, we're just getting started. The phone call ended with Tony's promise to document any signs of systematic bias in other districts, adding to the network of attorneys, court staff, and advocates who were now actively monitoring judicial fairness throughout the state. David opened his laptop one final time and began composing what would become known as the Anderson Doctrine, a comprehensive framework for identifying, investigating, and prosecuting systematic judicial bias that would be adopted by prosecutors' offices nationwide. The fundamental principle of equal justice under law, he wrote, requires constant vigilance and extraordinary courage from those sworn to uphold it. When judges systematically violate their oath to provide equal treatment, prosecutors must be willing to risk everything, including their own freedom, to document that bias and restore constitutional protections. The doctrine continued. The Harris case demonstrates that systematic judicial corruption can be exposed through careful statistical analysis, coordinated federal cooperation, innovative investigative techniques, and individual prosecutors willing to experience discrimination firsthand to create unimpeachable evidence. David's final section addressed the broader implications. This investigation represents more than one prosecutor exposing one corrupt judge. It establishes that no judicial authority, regardless of power or political protection, can systematically violate constitutional rights with impunity. When institutions fail, individuals must rise. When the powerful abuse their authority, those committed to justice must find ways to hold them accountable. As David finished writing, his assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, Channel 7 is here for your interview about the 6-month anniversary of the Harris case. Send them in." The news crew entered, led by reporter Jennifer Martinez, who had covered the Harris investigation from its explosive courtroom revelation to its federal prosecution. "Mr. Anderson," Martinez began as cameras rolled, "6 months ago you risked your career and your freedom to expose systematic judicial racism. Looking back, do you have any regrets about the extraordinary measures you took?" David considered the question carefully, his response carrying the weight of 43 overturned convictions and hundreds of lives restored to dignity. "My only regret is that it took so long to build a case strong enough to guarantee Harris's conviction and removal. Every day that investigation continued meant more families suffered under his discriminatory sentencing. Every delay meant more young black men received prison sentences that white defendants never faced." Martinez pressed further. "Some critics have argued that your methods, deliberately orchestrating your own arrest, set a dangerous precedent for prosecutorial conduct. How do you respond?" "I respond with results," David replied without hesitation. "Malik Jefferson is completing his college education instead of serving an unjust prison sentence. Marcus Williams received a gubernatorial pardon and is now studying law to fight the same injustices he experienced. 43 defendants have been resentenced or released entirely because their original convictions were products of systematic bias. He leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. Critics can debate methodology, while families torn apart by judicial racism are finally receiving justice. I choose results over academic discussions about prosecutorial ethics. What's next for your Civil Rights Division? Martinez asked, aware that David's investigation had expanded far beyond the original Harris case. We're implementing the Anderson Protocol in 17 states, training federal prosecutors to identify and investigate systematic judicial bias using the techniques we developed. 3 additional judges are currently under federal investigation, and preliminary evidence suggests the Harris case was part of a much larger pattern of corruption. David's expression grew more serious. But the most important work isn't prosecuting corrupt judges. It's rebuilding trust between communities and the justice system. Every family that suffered under Harris's bias needs to understand that justice eventually prevailed, even when it took extraordinary measures. As the interview concluded, Martinez asked one final question. If you could speak directly to other prosecutors who might be watching this, what would you tell them? David looked directly into the camera, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven that systematic change was possible through individual courage. I would tell them that justice delayed is justice denied, but justice exposed can never be hidden again. When you encounter systematic bias, corruption, or abuse of power, remember that you have both the authority and the responsibility to act. He paused, his words carrying the weight of months of investigation and personal risk. The badge you carry, the oath you took, the trust communities place in you, all of that means nothing if you're unwilling to risk everything when justice demands it. The Harris case proved that systematic corruption can be defeated, but only when prosecutors choose courage over comfort. David's final words would be quoted in law schools and prosecutor training programs across the country. And to every family that has suffered under systematic bias, to every defendant who received unjust sentences, to every person who believed the system would never change, today proves that justice finds a way when good people refuse to accept injustice. The cameras stopped rolling, but David's work continued. Outside his window, the courthouse stood as a symbol of what was possible, when individuals chose courage over comfort, when justice prevailed over corruption, and when systematic change began with one person willing to risk everything for what was right. Judge Robert Harris remained in federal prison, serving as a warning to any judicial authority who believed they could discriminate with impunity. David Anderson continued his work as Deputy Attorney General, proving daily that justice wasn't just an ideal, it was an achievable reality when pursued with extraordinary courage and unwavering commitment. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations demanding judicial accountability. Seeing this fight for equal justice from country to country, city to city, it proves that fairness in our courts is a fundamental human expectation. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more stories where corrupt systems face consequences. Until next time, remember that justice delayed is justice denied, but justice exposed can never be hidden again.